Today, we begin not just a historical inquiry, but a journey into the fog of the distant past, to an age where history and legend intertwine. Long before temples rose in Jerusalem, or prophets thundered from the hills, a group of nomadic tribes, bound by no kingdom, no flag, only a shared language and belief, began to settle in the rugged highlands of Canaan. Who were they? Where did they come from? The Bible tells us of a dramatic exodus from Egypt, of Moses parting the sea, of divine law thundered down from Sinai. But where is the evidence? Archaeology paints a more elusive portrait. The first mention of Israel in the historical record is not in Hebrew scripture, but carved into the stele of Pharaoh Merneptah in 1207 BC. Israel is laid waste, its seed is no more. A chilling line, brief, cryptic, and yet profound. It marks the moment when a people stepped into history. But they did not arrive in conquest, as the book of Joshua claims. Instead, they emerged from the ashes of a collapsing Bronze Age world. Pastoralists and raiders, perhaps descended from the mysterious Habiru or Shasu, migrating, intermarrying, surviving. No pharaoh recorded their exodus. No monument records a thunderous arrival. And yet, in the archaeological layers of Canaanite towns, in the ruins of tents turned to stone huts, in the curious absence of pig bones from their trash, the Israelites quietly took root. They were not conquerors. They were survivors. From these humble, often invisible beginnings, a people began to shape their identity, not in gold or glory, but in memory, myth, and the long struggle for belonging. By the end of the Bronze Age, the Israelites had begun to transform from wandering pastoralists into settlers, from tribal nomads into a people rooted in the land. At first, they lived in tents, guiding their flocks through the stony hills of Canaan. But slowly, stone enclosures rose around their livestock. Rudimentary homes began to replace the impermanence of cloth and rope. It was not conquest that defined their rise, but endurance, quiet, stubborn, and unrelenting. Among the many traits that set them apart, one stands out: their refusal to eat pork. This wasn't just a dietary quirk. It was identity carved into ritual. In the refuse heaps of their settlements, unlike those of their Canaanite, Philistine, and Amorite neighbors, pig bones are eerily absent. This wasn't an accident. It was a conscious declaration of difference, a defiance of surrounding cultures. Yet they were not alone in the land. The Canaanite cities around them still stood. Hazor, Megiddo, Lachish, Jericho, some burned to ash, others clinging to life. The biblical tale speaks of Joshua's swift and total conquest. But the ruins tell another story. The destruction came in waves, not from one nation, but from many forces: famine, war, and collapse. The Israelites were not an invading army. They were survivors of a regional apocalypse. They coexisted. They clashed. Sacred hills echoed with the cries of war and worship alike. They worshipped not one god, but many. Not in temples of marble, but in hilltop shrines, wooden altars, and stone circles. What they built was not yet a kingdom, but a fragile culture, forged in isolation, defined by difference, and destined one day to challenge the great empires of the ancient world. The Israelites had no king, only chieftains, warriors, prophets, and judges. This was the age before monarchies, before crowns and palaces, a brutal, lawless era where each tribe clung to its own. And justice came not from written law, but from the edge of a blade. The book of Judges speaks of heroes raised by God in times of crisis. In truth, they were warlords, charismatic, fierce, and often flawed, rising in moments of desperation, then fading into dust. Their enemies were many: the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Canaanite city kings, but none rivaled the relentless menace of the Philistines. These newcomers were not desert wanderers. They were seafarers, born of the Aegean world, armed with iron, and organized into a confederation of 5 fortified cities: Ashdod, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, and Gath. They brought with them secrets the Israelites had never seen: iron blades that shattered bronze, tactics born from centuries of Mediterranean warfare, and a hunger for conquest. With each battle, the Israelites fractured further, their tribal bonds strained under the weight of superior weaponry and coordinated Philistine aggression. Unity was fleeting, defeat devastating. The Philistines pushed deeper into the heart of Canaan, seizing territory, crushing resistance, and tightening their grip. The tribes cried out for leadership, for a king who could unite them, command armies, and finally stand against the iron tide. Out of this chaos, the foundation for monarchy was laid. But it did not come easily. It came in blood, fear, and fire. The judges fought, not just against foreign enemies, but against the disintegration of identity itself. And in the shadows of defeat, a new power began to stir, one that would change the fate of Israel forever. Out of the chaos, a leader emerged. His name was Saul, tall, formidable, chosen by the tribes in desperation. For the first time, the Israelites were united under one man, not a prophet, not a judge, but a king. Saul wielded power like a sword, fierce in battle, relentless against the Philistines. Yet unity proved fragile. Haunted by paranoia, crippled by disobedience, Saul's reign spiraled into madness. At Mount Gilboa, his army shattered. Saul and his sons fell. Their bodies were hung on Philistine walls, a brutal symbol of Israel's defeat and humiliation. But from the ashes of Saul's failure rose a new figure, one who would forever define the soul of a nation: David. A shepherd, a poet, a warrior, a fugitive who became king. With cunning and courage, David struck at Israel's enemies. He seized Jerusalem, turning it from Jebusite stronghold into holy capital. His conquests were swift, his justice harsh, his charisma unmatched. The tribes rallied behind him, borders expanded, tribute flowed in. He was not merely a king, he was the embodiment of Israel's defiance and hope. After David came Solomon, his son, a ruler not of swords, but of splendor. His reign brought peace, his court shimmered with wealth, wisdom, and wonder. Foreign envoys crossed deserts to hear his judgments. Under Solomon, the temple was built, not just of stone and cedar, but of ambition and faith. Yet behind the golden walls, shadows stirred. Though Solomon's grandeur dazzled the world, cracks began to form. Forced labor, heavy taxation, and growing discontent threatened the unity David had fought to build. As his reign waned, the seeds of division were already taking root. The age of kings had begun, but so too had the long, slow unraveling of Israel's fragile unity. We often imagine ancient Israel as the cradle of monotheism, the land where belief in one true God began. But the truth is far more complex, far more unsettling. Before Yahweh stood alone, he shared the heavens with many. This was not yet Judaism, not as we know it. It was Yahwism, a raw, tribal faith where altars dotted the hillsides and gods walked among men. Yahweh reigned, yes, but he did not reign alone. At his side stood Asherah, his divine consort, worshipped in secret and in plain sight. Inscriptions scratched onto pottery whisper their names together. Blessed be Yahweh and his Asherah. Figurines, small, delicate, and many, litter the ruins of Israelite homes, evidence of a household religion far more diverse than later scriptures would admit. In the north, where Phoenician influence seeped through trade and marriage, the supreme god was El. Elsewhere, gods like Baal, Chemosh, and Shamash held sway. The names change, the faiths intertwine. Even the sacred texts reflect this struggle, sometimes calling God Yahweh, other times Elohim, echoing the tension between merging identities. There were no single temples, no singular doctrine. Shrines stood on every hilltop, sacrifices burned in sacred groves, and not all offerings were of animals. Dark references in the Bible and grim archaeological finds point to a chilling truth. Child sacrifice, practiced on altars not unlike those in Carthage and Phoenicia. Later scribes, writing from exile or reform, would frame this era as one of idolatry, a time of sin, backsliding, and divine wrath. But in reality, this was the soul of early Israel, fragmented, passionate, searching. The road to monotheism was not a sudden revelation. It was a long, bloody struggle to silence the many voices of the gods. Solomon was dead. The golden age was over. What followed was not mourning, but rebellion. His son, Rehoboam, inherited the throne, but not his father's wisdom. When the northern tribes begged for relief from heavy taxes and forced labor, he answered with arrogance and threats. The result was catastrophic. 10 tribes broke away. They crowned their own king, Jeroboam, and the once united kingdom shattered. Now there were 2 Israels, 2 dreams. In the north, the kingdom of Israel rose swiftly, rich in trade, fertile in land, ambitious in spirit. Capitals shifted from Shechem to Tirzah and finally to Samaria, a city destined for splendor and ruin. But political stability proved elusive. 19 kings followed in quick succession. Dynasties fell as easily as they rose, often by the dagger. In contrast, the south, the kingdom of Judah, clung to the house of David. Smaller, poorer, more isolated, Judah claimed divine legitimacy through Jerusalem and its temple. But it too was not immune to the tides of power, faith, and betrayal. As these 2 kingdoms eyed each other with suspicion, a storm gathered on the horizon. From the northeast, the Assyrian Empire grew monstrous in ambition. At first, both Israel and Judah paid tribute, a desperate attempt to delay the inevitable. But Assyria would not be appeased forever. The kingdom of Israel, despite its strength, made a fatal miscalculation, aligning with Egypt against Assyria. In 722 BC, after a brutal siege, Samaria fell. Its people were dragged into exile, scattered across foreign lands, never to return. They would become known as the lost tribes of Israel. From unity to division, from glory to exile, the dream of a chosen people now fractured, and the shadow of conquest loomed ever larger over the land. The smoke still rose from Samaria's ruins when the refugees began to arrive. Thousands poured into Judah, weary, hungry, broken. Entire families fled the collapse of the northern kingdom, bringing with them their fears their customs, and their gods. Jerusalem, once a modest hilltop city of 25,000, swelled to nearly 100,000 souls. Streets overflowed. New walls rose. Change was inevitable. Ruling in this time of upheaval was Hezekiah, a king born for crisis. He saw not just a political opportunity, but a divine mission. The kingdom needed unity, religious, cultural, spiritual. And so began one of the most radical reformations in Israelite history. The shrines in hills were torn down, the altars smashed, idols burned. Worship would no longer be scattered. It would be centralized in Jerusalem, in the temple. Even Passover was rescheduled, rebranded, transformed into a national symbol of reunification. But reform invited wrath. To the north, the Assyrian war machine stirred again. Under Sennacherib, the empire marched, laying waste to fortress after fortress. Judah's cities fell like dominoes. The enemy stood at Jerusalem's gates. Hezekiah, defiant yet desperate, emptied the temple's gold to pay a ransom. Only then did the siege lift. The city was spared, but barely. And while Hezekiah's reforms had united the kingdom for a moment, they were fragile, temporary. His son, Manasseh, reversed everything, rebuilding pagan altars, restoring foreign gods, even placing idols inside the sacred temple. What Hezekiah had built with conviction, Manasseh dismantled with ease. The people, once united by fear and faith, drifted again into confusion. Judah had survived Assyria's wrath, for now. But within its walls, a deeper fracture had begun, one that no army could repair. In the shadow of crumbling empires, a child king rose. Josiah, great-great-grandson of Hezekiah, inherited a fractured kingdom, torn between old idols and forgotten promises. But unlike his father and grandfather, Josiah burned with purpose. He launched a purge. Altars were smashed, temples desecrated, and the high places, once sacred, turned into latrines. Worship was no longer scattered. It was to be focused solely in Jerusalem. Then came a revelation. As the temple was being restored, a scroll was found, the Book of Deuteronomy. To Josiah, it was no less than divine instruction. To modern historians, it was the first chapter of the Torah, written not on Sinai, but in the political fires of reform. With this discovery, Josiah codified his revolution. The law was clear. Yahweh alone, one temple, one people. For a moment, Judah had hope, a flickering flame in a darkening world. But beyond its borders, giants stirred. Assyria waned, Babylon rose, Egypt marched north to reclaim power, and in a fatal decision, Josiah confronted them at Megiddo and died by the sword. His death unraveled everything. Successive kings, Jehoahaz, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, danced between empires, trying to save Judah through shifting allegiances. But Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar II, had no patience for disobedience. When Zedekiah, Judah's final king, rebelled with Egypt's promise, the response was swift and merciless. In 586 BC, Jerusalem burned. The temple, the heart of Judah's faith and identity, was reduced to rubble. Its treasures looted, its people exiled. What began with a boy king's reforms ended in fire, chains, and silence. The Babylonian exile had begun, a cataclysm not just of statehood, but of spirit. And yet, in exile, the memory endured. A people broken, but not erased. The walls of Jerusalem had fallen. The great temple of Solomon lay in ruins. Smoke choked the skies. Ashes covered the earth. The people of Judah, once chosen, once proud, were chained and marched eastward toward an unfamiliar land. It was not just a physical journey into Babylonian exile. It was a descent into crisis, silence, and transformation. The exile was more than punishment. It was a rupture in time. Kings were no more. Priests were scattered. Sacrifices ceased. The very core of Israelite religion, the temple, the altar, the land, had been taken. And yet, in that void, something astonishing began to take shape. A new identity emerged, not built on kingship or conquest, but on memory, scripture, and survival. Far from Jerusalem, the exiles gathered in homes, in study, in whispered prayer. Oral traditions were written down. Laws were codified. The stories of Abraham, Moses, and David were preserved, not as legend, but as lifelines. What began in pain became preservation. What had once been tribal and polytheistic was being reforged into monotheism, shaped by loss and longing. In Babylon, Yahweh was no longer just a local god of Judah's hills. He became the universal God, unseen yet present everywhere. The exile forced the people to ask the unthinkable. Could their God be worshipped without a temple, without land, without sacrifice? The answer, slowly, painfully, was yes. And so, amid defeat, the soul of Judaism was born anew. A people torn from their homeland refused to vanish. Instead, they rewrote their destiny. The exile had stripped away everything except the will to remember, to believe, to endure. Out of destruction came resilience. From silence a voice that would echo for millennia. The Babylonian exile should have been the end. Cities were destroyed, temples desecrated, kings and warriors reduced to captives in a foreign land. Yet instead of vanishing, the people of Israel did something few in history have ever achieved. They endured, not with swords or empires, but through memory, faith, and the written word. In the heart of exile, scribes set ink to parchment. The stories of creation, covenant, and kingship were gathered, edited, reimagined. Myths became messages. Laws became lifelines. The Torah, once an oral tradition whispered across generations, became scripture, sacred and unbreakable. It was in Babylon, not Jerusalem, that Judaism began to take its most recognizable shape. Without a temple, worship shifted inward. Prayer replaced sacrifice. The synagogue replaced the altar. A dispersed people began to see themselves not just as a nation, but as a spiritual community, bound not by land or power, but by text, law, and tradition. This was not merely survival. It was reinvention. And when Babylon itself fell to Persia, and the exiles were allowed to return, they came back changed. They rebuilt Jerusalem. They laid a second foundation, not just of stone, but of purpose. The memory of exile would never fade. It became their warning, their theology, their strength. Centuries later, these texts and teachings would transcend borders. The legacy of ancient Israel would inspire Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, faiths that would shape the minds, morals, and destinies of billions. The story of ancient Israel did not end in ruin. It endured through fire, exile, and silence, not as a forgotten kingdom, but as a living idea, an idea that no empire, however mighty, could ever truly erase. History is never written in silence. It is forged by the victors, shaped by survivors, and too often missing its other half. For ancient Israel, that missing half is the northern kingdom, a land once rich in cities, in kings, in worship, now remembered only through the eyes of its rival, Judah. Every story we know, every line of scripture, every condemnation of idolatry, every judgment cast, comes from the southern kingdom. To Judah's scribes, the north was a cautionary tale, a kingdom of apostasy and betrayal, of golden calves and foreign gods. Its kings were wicked, its people faithless. But what if that's not the whole truth? We have no surviving scrolls from Samaria, no royal annals from the house of Omri, no psalms written beneath the high walls of Jezreel. The voices of the northern prophets, the priests, the poets, all have been lost to conquest, exile, and time. what remains is filtered through Judah's lens, biased, bruised, and burning with justification. What did the people of the north believe? How did they view Jerusalem's temple, its claims to divine monopoly, its rejection of alternate worship? Did they see themselves as heretics, or simply as another face of the same faith? The silence is deafening. And yet, in that silence, we are reminded that history is fragile, shaped by flame, by exile, by who survives and who is erased. The fall of Israel in 722 BC was not just the destruction of cities. It was the erasure of an entire narrative. We will never fully know the story they would have told, but in the shadow of what was lost, we can still ask, what might they have said if only someone had listened? The story of ancient Israel teaches us a powerful lesson. Even in exile, identity can endure. When all seems lost, home, power, certainty, what truly sustains us is memory, unity, and the courage to adapt. In today's world, where change is constant and displacement is real, we must preserve our values, embrace learning, and stay resilient. Just like the exiles who turned crisis into renewal, we too can transform hardship into strength. Cherish your roots, write your own story, and remember, survival is not enough. It is how we grow through struggle that defines who we are.